What is going on, everyone? Welcome to today's event, the State of the B2B Podcast Listener. Have been super excited for this event for some time, ever since we started promoting it. I want to welcome you all. My name is Brett McGrath. I lead marketing at The Juice. I want to first say just thank you for being out there. I know it is challenging to carve out some time during your day to come hang with us. We released the report last week, the State of the B2B Podcast Listener report. Hopefully you all got a chance to see that. If you have not seen that already, we are going to flash some QR codes so you can get it scanned and get that report. The report was our opportunity at The Juice to begin to answer a very complex question that's been on our mind, and I know a lot of our customers' minds for some time, and that is, what do listeners really want from branded podcasts? So what we set out to do in the report on The Juice is to use our product data, dig into the engagement from our members and how they were interacting with B2B branded podcasts, and start to answer that question. So we've got a really good response so far from the report. We're excited to do more data-driven reports. But with that being said, we're going to talk about podcast listeners in this one. If you have not had a chance to attend an event at The Juice, it is going to be super conversational. Like, it is pretty laid back. We are going to bring each of the speakers, which I'll introduce in a second, up individually to talk about their specific areas. And then at the end, we'll bring everyone up to answer some questions. There is a chat panel you'll see on the right side of the screen. If you have questions, like, drop those in. The more questions, the better. We will carve out some time to get to those at the end. But when I thought about curating this list or group of people today, I was very intentional. I obviously used the report, but I thought about the relationships that I had just in the industry. And these three people stood out to me as people that needed to be on this podcast, as, you know, because I view them as thought leaders in the space. Fatima Zaidi, who's the founder and CEO at Quill / CoHost, will be joining us. Quill and CoHost was actually a co-sponsor of the report. I've had a great time interacting with her people and their brand. We at The Juice use CoHost to host Modern Day Marketer, which is our podcast. So they have an awesome product. I would highly recommend you check them out if you're looking for a hosting solution, and they have an awesome services business as well. Tristan Pelligrino, who is, I will just say, a serial entrepreneur in the podcast space. He is Marketers in Demand, New North, and Motion are just three different businesses he has his hands on. We have partnered in just so many conversations around content, around podcasting. And I have had a chance to see the amazing work that Motion does in doing a video series talking about juice data, slice and dice, which Motion helps support. They do absolutely incredible work. So if you're in need of some podcast production, definitely hit up Tristan and team. And then Margaret Kelsey is just an awesome marketer in the space, who I've had a chance to meet early in my days at The Juice. She's worked for some incredible brands like Envision, AppQs, and OpenView. And now she has set sail on her own venture, doing consulting work with TatCo, and has a podcast herself called Don't Say Content, which is phenomenal. If you are on LinkedIn, I'm sure you have seen the clips of her and her co-host Devin taking on a bunch of topics. So that will be the crew today. Just one more slide, and I'm going to welcome Margaret here in a second. But just say, like, maybe we need to update it since they don't call it Twitter anymore, I guess. But join the conversation on whatever you call the platform. There's some handles. There is actually a QR code that you'll follow the topic of podcast marketing on The Juice. So hit up that QR code. We're very focused on topics and shrinking the C in B2B marketing around specific topics. So you hit up that QR code, you'll get access to resources around adjacent things that we're talking about today, along with the report itself. tweet at us, do the LinkedIn thing, follow us, you know the drill. But without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to welcome Margaret Kelsey. Margaret, will you join us on stage? Welcome. Coming in hot. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I can't complain. I always, when we do these events, it always just seems like there's like this big buildup, and then we get here, and it's like, all right, I'm just excited to talk. This will be fun. I feel like there's a lot of fun things based on your experience, what you're currently working on, that will hit the ground running. But I'll just like brief the audience. We're going to be talking with Margaret about just understanding the B2B podcast listener from the host perspective. Maybe before we dive into the topic, I always like to give our speakers a chance to kind of like plug their stuff a little bit. So I know I talked about it up front, but maybe since you've been kind of on this solopreneur journey, anything just you want to share just with the audience about kind of what you're working on and what you're doing?
Yeah. So I'm coming up on a year anniversary of being on my own, which is really wonderful. I've worked with about 9 clients so far in the last year. And I tend to work with founders and their heads of marketing to think about really building strategic marketing programs for the business. And I think right now it's an interesting time period because channels and even buying behavior and SaaS is changing underneath us really rapidly. So it's a fun time to kind of rip down all the old playbooks and build something that's bespoke and hopefully as future proofed as we can do right now. And so I've been having a wonderful time. And then part of that too has freed up enough space to create the podcast that you mentioned. So I have Don't Say Content with my co-host Devin. And we have a weekly show where we try to not do a lot of takeaways and tactics, but we really try to explore the messy middle of a lot of things that we're experiencing in the marketing world right now.
And I think that's why your show stands out to me. And I think you tear down these old playbooks. Like anyone who's waving that flag, I'm certainly a fan of. Let's talk about the podcast a little bit. When you decided that you were going to go jump in and do this, what sort of gaps were you and Devin, I guess, looking to fill for your audience with the type of content that you're producing on Don't Say Content?
Yeah. So we very much looked at the landscape and saw that a lot of marketing podcasts are guest based and interview style. And listen, we love that. But I think the thing that Devin and I thought was most differentiated was her and my chemistry. So we got on calls before we had a podcast and would go out to coffee and stuff and would just riff for a long period of time. And I would end those conversations and be really inspired and be thinking about something in a new way. We have a lot of overlapping. We're like a Venn diagram of beliefs. So we have a good fair amount of overlap, but there's definitely times where we'll take some opposite stances. And we had a hunch that would be really useful to have out in more of the public discussion on maybe a little bit of our private feedback. And so we started to think about a format for the show, and we specifically decided to bet on our chemistry and have that consistency. The other thing that is kind of I think probably because we've spent so much time in content marketing is that we were almost allergic to kind of wrapping up the episode and to like, oh, here are your clear takeaways of the things that you can do or the tactical implementation of it. So we also made a very specific choice to avoid that and to really use the podcast as an exploration of the things that are going on right now without wrapping it up into a neat little bow.
So I think what's interesting about like betting on yourselves and not doing the guest thing is that in a way that seems like it's super unique in our space. All right. We have guests, we curate ideas, we curate people. And a side effect as podcast people is that those individuals, help promote the show, help promote the brand. And that's something that, is kind of a side effect that most podcast hosts and guests get. Now, obviously, if it's just the two of you and you're betting on your chemistry and you're not bringing in guests, that is not a part of kind of the maybe
growth
promotion
strategy. Yeah.
So maybe I'd love to learn a little bit more about that on your end and how you think about that.
Yeah, so definitely it kneecaps us a little bit in terms of growth strategy because we don't have guests that are sharing it through their platforms. At the same time, I think Devin and I were very clear that the target audience that we want to go after is not a unlimited TAM, right? That there's not, it's not for the entire world. It is for strategic marketing leaders and founders that want to learn more about marketing at a very senior level. And we talk very specifically in the vein of B2B SaaS and a little bit of like agencies that serve B2B SaaS. And so there's not like we need to grow this podcast to have a listenership of, tens of thousands of people. We're trying to go deep rather than wide.
We get so caught up in quantity, and I love what you said there and just being super focused, and that makes a ton of sense. Now, talking about the people that are listening to your show, obviously we're talking about the B2B podcast listener. I think it's always a challenge with podcasts on trying to understand like who are the people, what is the demographic. I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you all are, what signals are you looking at in order to understand like who are those people who are tuning in every week?
Yeah. And so I've found through my career that content and message, the way it resonates with a target audience is almost kind of divorced from the platform in which or the channel in which they consume it in. Like content that's going to resonate with let's say a founder is going to resonate with a founder whether or not they see it on Instagram or they see it on YouTube or they see it on LinkedIn. And so when we're thinking about this black box that podcasts can feel like sometimes, we feel confident to look at the proxies of the channels that we know that we can see a little bit more of the demographics. Like I look at the clips that I share on LinkedIn and I'll be able to see and drill down a little bit deeper into the demographics of people who are watching or rewatching those. And to me, that's a fine proxy to say, oh, it's, this clip resonated and 70% of the watchers or the viewers of this clip were founders. So I can kind of tailor that a little bit better and understand that that's probably similar to the podcast itself. We use Casted, and so there is some visibility into brands, not necessarily demographics in terms of role or whatnot, but we can see which brands are listening to the podcast. So I think podcast tech is getting a little bit more advanced to be able to do that. But I think a proxy of looking at your other channels and what that content that you're maybe repurposing from your podcast and what the demographics that it's resonating with there is perfectly fine. And then it's also anecdotal feedback. I mean, I know marketers love hard data and measurement, but it tends to be the people that are reaching out to me to say, hey, I listened to that one that today was really meaningful to me. We just released an episode last week about data in marketing, and I had a couple people DM me on LinkedIn and say, hey, I just listened to that this morning and that really struck a chord with me. So that to me, when I look at the folks that are doing that, I know that I'm creating content for the right kind of level or demographic of folks.
I've noticed definitely a focus from you and the promotion of the show, definitely through LinkedIn by seeing the clips and seeing, it's like, I don't know, every week I know you all are producing new content because I look and I see, whatever the clip is that you're promoting. And then I see the engagement on LinkedIn. You mentioned other channels. How much do you put like what's happening with those clips, like the engagement, comments, like how much do you take that into consideration when you're thinking about, the demographic and if the right people are listening to your show or not?
Yeah. So I've definitely made a focus on to double down on LinkedIn. We over the last couple months have played around with, do we care about TikTok? Do we not care about TikTok? Devin and I always preach prioritization and kind of radical focus when you're putting together marketing, especially kind of from 0 to 1. And so we had to take a tough look at ourselves and have the same sort of thing. And so what we've landed on right now is Substack, YouTube, obviously podcast and the channels in which you can listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all those great things. And then I've focused on LinkedIn. And so we each have kind of a clear focus of the channels that we're trying to grow, but we have pared that down where we've kind of stopped caring about TikTok and Instagram as channels to saturate for our content.
talk to me a little bit about the topic selection, because I feel like the premise of your show and what you're attacking, like there are so many different areas. I'm curious how you're curating ideas that you think will resonate with the people that you're trying to reach. Talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, about 90% of episodes have just come from Devin and I's brain of something that we're talking to clients about, or something that feels like maybe a common refrain in our lives over the last few weeks, where we'll jot that down and put it in a planning doc. But we did recently run a little test and ask our Substack audience what they would want to hear, and we got a couple good topics sourced from those folks. So we're trying to find it in all different ways, but there's definitely doing both audience listening, but also just it was a big bet on again Devin and I's chemistry, and so I think the more that it can come from authentic places of things that her and I are very passionate about, the more that will show up in terms of the quality of content that we produce.
Totally. I'm
like
gonna
we need to be
dig
able
in.
to rant, we got to riff, we got to rant, we got to be mad.
That's how I view your brand. It's like there's like some rants. It's
the angry ladies.
that's actually not bad positioning. The Angry Ladies SaaS podcast about hot marketing.
Getting
takes.
sassy.
So maybe digging into the report a little bit. So spending time in just the data, which is not something like this has been a forcing function to me, but it's been really good. And one of the observations that, we made when putting this together was 6 out of the top 10 most engaged podcasts on the Juice were also a part of the 40 most followed brands. So that the thought process here was that, like, if someone is listening to your podcast is, regularly being consumed by listeners, then the likelihood of them going to follow you on other channels goes up. I'm curious, since you started Don't Say Content and you're consistent with, the delivery of your episodes, have you seen new people come into, let's say, your LinkedIn world and, request to follow you or request a connection, or any other channels? Any stories there?
Oh yeah, it's been huge. And so I'll say too that the way that the podcast was created is not how normally a B2B brand would create a podcast. Like Devin and I were like, do we want to just play in a sandbox and have fun? And I was not thinking about it as lead generation for my advising and consulting business. I was thinking it as a separate play, like a sandbox. And so I will say that that's not normal, right? Most brands, when they're creating a podcast, have a true business purpose for it. But I will say I've seen that also, where the more consistent I am delivering content on LinkedIn, the more consistent follower growth that I'm seeing, the more folks are reaching out, following me. And I have seen now, we launched the podcast in February, and about a month ago, I think, was my first cold inbound lead from seeing my stuff on LinkedIn. And I've had a couple since. So it is so funny that it ends up being, who would have thought, lead generation, even though I created it as just something that I was thinking was going to be adjacent to my business.
Does that cause you to respond or react with the way you approach your content any differently, or is it just business as usual?
So I think it's freeing that I know that I can show up, and as long as I feel very confident in my beliefs and how they're translated in a podcast episode, I think of it as a better forcing function to be a magnet to repel away maybe clients that would have been a bad fit anyways, versus the ones that are really going to like the way that I talk, communicate my thoughts and how I frame things and how I deliver things. So again, I think it's a little different that I know when you're in a B2B setting, because I've done this, you always have to think, what does my target audience need? What does my business need? And your business needs probably as many customers as possible, especially in the near term in the world today. And I get to be a little choosier because my business is not volume based and because it's relationship based. So I think that it probably will work for you either way, but there is some nuance there about you can't be so brash and you can't be known as like an angry lady if you're trying to be a B2B software business that's trying to attract lots of different types of customers.
You all should check it out. Don't Say Content. Margaret, this was fun. We'll have you back at the end for some questions. Put in your questions. We'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. See you soon.
Tristan, we will welcome Tristan up on stage. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Tristan, welcome. How are you?
Brett, what's going on? Good to see you here.
Good to see you. We're going to be talking with Tristan about designing shows that connect with your listeners. Tristan, I can't even begin to describe all of the plates you have spinning right now, and with the businesses and everything you're pushing forward. Yeah. But I'd love to give you the opportunity to share with the audience kind of what you're up to, what you've been working on over, the last few months.
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind introduction, Brett. You're right. I do have a lot of plates that are spinning up in the air. Hopefully none of them drop. But yeah, we actually, earlier this year, Motion, my podcast agency, acquired another agency called New North. And both agencies actually serve the same customer, which is that small, lean, scrappy marketing team at a B2B tech company. In a lot of cases, we're producing shows for folks that really serves that content engine. And then from there, we're amplifying that in through paid channels, ABM, SEO in some cases, et cetera. So with those two agencies running, we also have something that's really in line with the topic of this conversation, which is marketers in demand. And that's actually where we have almost 10 shows right now that are all really built around helping B2B marketers get better at what they do. And there are a lot of specific shows that we can get into, but that really media brand serves as kind of our content engine that works across the multiple agencies we have.
That's awesome. It's been fun to watch the growth, and definitely I tune in for the regular updates on LinkedIn. Maybe to kick things off, I think the foundational stuff around creating a podcast, I know is a world you live in and is really important, but we don't always think about. So I'm curious, just off the jump, like, what are the most important steps to take in the early stages of creating a podcast in order to kind of maximize your chances of connecting with that intended audience?
Yeah, the two biggest things, and look, there are a lot of things that you can put in a podcast creative brief or whatever. I mean, it could be 30 pages long, but I think before you start a podcast for your brand, which is really what we're talking about here, you have to define who the podcast is for and how it's going to help them, from my perspective. I mean, those are the two biggest ingredients. And if you can't do that, then you're really flying blind in a lot of ways. And, you might struggle and not really wonder if this is working for you. But if you can say very specifically, here's who I want to connect with, what does that mean? Like, get very detailed, not a marketing professional, like, what type of marketing professional? Is it a director? Is it a CMO? Like, let's define that. Is it at a different stage company? Is it a startup? Is it a company that has more product market fit? It's downstream more. Is their team large? Is their team small? It's like, really define who that person is. And then once you know that, try to uncover how the show will help them, which is really in my eyes, the primary reason that you create a podcast is to create ideas from folks that are, in your space, also communicate your own ideas from your company's perspective. And all that can be rolled into how you actually help that listener. And those to me are really the two ingredients that you start with. And then you kind of build layers from there. Like, what's the format? Is there a different hook that we're going to use? Are we going to play with the episode structure a little bit? There are a lot of things that you can do to spice it up after you get those two foundational components in place.
So I'm sensing a theme between what you just said and kind of what Margaret was talking about. And it's this maybe niching down and having a focus on who you're trying to reach, even if it's not a broad group of people. And it seems like, just as marketers, we have this inclination to always kind of cast the wide net up front. And when I think about a podcast, it's like, all right, the business case to try to create one internally is a struggle. And then we get these questions from management and our boss and boss's boss about KPIs and how many people we're going to bring in. And it's almost like the more and more I talk with people like you about it, it's almost like you need to have a focus. And if you have a focus, it's not going to probably start off with, thousands of people listening, but the chances of it starting off with the right type of people from the jump increases. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that dynamic, just in how marketers are typically hardwired, and maybe how the most impactful podcasts work when there's a focus.
Yeah, it's difficult because, we get a lot of folks that reach out to us to produce shows. They're under a lot of pressure to communicate to management, like, hey, if we do launch this podcast, here's how many downloads you can expect within the first 3 to 6 months. And frankly, that's a very hard question to answer. And I think what we try to even do in a lot of cases is look at it from a completely different perspective, which is, what if it doesn't have any downloads? It literally has 0 in Spotify. All right, let's start there. But what can the podcast then do for you? It's really a sandbox almost. Margaret actually used that word up here a few minutes ago, where I feel like if you're having conversations internally and you're having conversations with other industry experts, you're bringing on prospects and customers. Just think about really that conversation flywheel that you're creating that really sparks the development of all kinds of content that's really designed to helping your customer. Like, shouldn't that be one of your primary goals as a marketing team? And if that is really the vehicle that you're using to do it, then I'm not really sure, why you would focus on downloads initially. And so that's why I encourage folks to get as detailed as possible with that audience, because then you really truly are connecting with them and helping them. And if you take that approach with 0 downloads out of the gate, then the pressure's off, and you have a different objective, which is solving problems. Because if you want to go the download route and your goal is to build a show that, has thousands, tens of thousands of downloads, and then you want to bring on sponsors and so forth, then I don't know if going detailed and niche is the way to go, because you're handcuffing yourself, and you're not going to get the the listenership that you need to then bring on those sponsors. So it's really a choice you have to make up front, I believe.
Maybe getting in the weeds a little bit on tactics, pulling out a stat from the report that was kind of eye-opening for me, but 58% of the most listened to or most engaged podcast episode titles in the report, out of the top 100, had an actionable title, like how to, or words like building, changing, turning. And that was that when I saw the data, it had me take a step back and think about what are we calling episodes? Are we doing a good enough job here? Could we increase our chances of increased visibility and listenership if we were to tinker with the titles a little bit? And it was almost like me going back to marketing 101 in a way of just focusing in on the headline and making sure that it's a headline that people will engage with. From your experience in just being in the podcast world, how important is creating actionable headlines, and thinking about episode titles?
Yeah, I think titles are big. I think all of us as marketers understand that the headline is what attracts people initially. I was encouraged to see that stat, actually, because I think it's a good sign, but I think it also just speaks to podcasting as a medium. If we think about that title, building, changing, turning from this to that, the fundamental reason behind those titles is it's a transformation. So it's a story in many ways. And I think that lends itself really well to the podcast medium. When you bring on a guest, or even if it's a solo episode, what can you do to convey that story? How can you explain your story, your transformation for someone else, to inspire them, to educate them? And it's very hard to do that in a 2,500 word blog post, or it is impossible to do on LinkedIn and short form content at that level. And so I think the podcasting medium gives you the opportunity to really get into some of those details of a story, get into some of the emotional aspects of decisions that were made around a challenge or something that you had to overcome as a professional. And you're able to explore that in let's say a 20 to 30 minute episode. And you just don't have that luxury in some of the other formats that we see.
So digging into maybe some more data, and this is opposite of what we just talked about with Margaret and what she's doing in her strategy, but we saw 60% or 6 out of the top 10 highest performing podcast episodes on the report featured guests. I'm curious, how do you advise your clients on the importance or lack of importance of guest selection when they're producing new podcast episodes?
I think doing an interview driven show is a really good way to start. It depends on the skill sets that you have internally as a team. Like Margaret, for example, I mean, the rapport she has with her co-host is a really strong suit for developing a show. But if you look at your company, I mean, who's to say that you have that already baked in to your team? So I think the answer, you might not like it, Brett, but it depends. It depends on what you have at your disposal. So I think, a common denominator in a lot of cases is this guest-driven interview style show that you can start with as really that first stage. Like, go out and have conversations with all these people in your space, customers, prospects, internal folks, leadership, and it'll give you a foundation that you can build on. And then maybe you do through the development of the show, maybe you find that you do have like this really unique rapport with a co-host or something, and then you can explore that a little further and say, hey, let's double down on that. Like maybe we do a solo episode, or maybe we do a co-host scenario where it's just us two riffing on an idea. You can go down a couple different avenues, and you're not necessarily stuck with just that guest-driven approach. But back to your original statistic, Brett. I mean, I think guests are important to really get a show going. I think it does help spark some ideas. But then I do feel like you have to figure out some other ways to not always depend on guests, because that could be a crutch, and it could also be a really big bottleneck if you're always waiting on people, or you're always relying upon other folks to drive your content. Then that puts you in a rough position as well.
Well, I'm going, maybe another one on that note is, I think what I heard from you is that you've got to treat your podcast like it's, a living, breathing product, and it's got to evolve and it's got to change. And you as the host need to be aware of when these moments are. I guess, what are some of the signals or observations that you or clients you've worked with have seen when there's that moment of saying, you know what, we've been doing the guest route and we've actually got some thoughts of our own, so we're going to start doing solo episodes? Like, what are those signals or things that you look for when making those types of changes and decisions midstream?
Yeah, so there's one, it's the bottleneck effect. So a lot of times if you have a guest-driven show, and just the administrative work that it takes to book someone's time, to find a time that works for everyone, to bring them on the show, to do the prep work. I mean, there's just a lot of work that goes into that's dependent upon an external resource that doesn't have as much investment into your show. And so I think when you see that bottleneck becoming an issue, it might be time to explore another format where, hey, you could fill in those gaps. Like, you still maybe have interviews scheduled, and that's a big part of your show, but all right, what else can I do to really fill in those holes where maybe, we had a couple guests drop out, or, they pushed something to the first part of the year and they couldn't get on their calendar for December. Well, maybe we have a bank of content that we have some solo episodes that we can explore, get those into the post-production workflow and pursue it that way. So that's one piece of it, where there's this bottleneck, and you just might have to push through it another way outside of guests. And then the other one is, sometimes you just get bored with the format. Let's be honest. It's like, all right, I need to change something, and this, is getting a little monotonous for me and for the team, and we need to do something fresh and new. So let's, and rather than scrapping something altogether, let's introduce something new. Let's try it. And if it fails, it falls flat, then maybe we try something else. So, and that's really a lot of what we do, quite honestly, with Marketers in Demand. We have interview-driven shows, but a lot of the shows that we create are really our playground. We have a show that was launched recently called Content Head with Joe Michalowski, who's a solo content person at a B2B tech company, and they're all solo episodes. So he's speaking to camera, and he starts with a story, and he kind of talks about a challenge that he had and how he overcame it. And it's really directed to other folks that are head of content, and they're really working by themselves at a B2B tech company. That's who he's speaking directly to. And the only way we're able to do that is to change formats and launch a new show and kind of do something in a unique way. And so we're always experimenting ourselves. And because I get bored, I have to take different paths. You have to always grow as a marketer and just as a professional. So that's what I try to do too.
Let's close it out here. And I think I already know your answer, but this is like an exclamation point for this section when talking about being general with the podcast and the structure versus being specific. I think I know the answer, but maybe if you just want to like double down just in terms of like, if you are a marketer and you're trying to reach a subset of people and you're thinking about starting a podcast, like what would you advise in terms of like the approach? More people, less people, mixture of both? Talk a little bit about that.
I think you should create 10 to 20 shows. No, I'm just kidding. But that's what we've done. I think get as detailed as possible to where it's almost uncomfortable, but it's like, hey, if I am speaking or having a conversation, like who are literally the 4 to 5 people that would really benefit from this? Like have that dialogue up front when you're developing a show. If you can do that, I think that puts you in a much better spot than going more general and broad with your category or what have you. And I think it's always just a balancing act. If leadership is comfortable where you're not necessarily looking at the download metrics in the first month or two, and you have some of that freedom up front. Or I know, Brett, you had a lot of that freedom when you came on board at the Juice. I know we've had that conversation where you're like, hey, with Jonathan, I'm going to create a podcast. That's really what's going to get this flywheel going. I doubt that you all were scrutinizing your download numbers in those first few months. So I would encourage folks to take a very similar path, niche down as much as possible, as much as you can, because you can always add another show or you can do a series that might expand upon the topic a little bit more. There's some things that you can do to go more broad later on. And but if you start with that detailed foundation, I think it puts you in a much better spot there.
Could go on for hours and hours about that topic you just teased for me, and maybe we'll do that at another date. But Tristan, this was fun. I'll have you back up for a Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Always fun, Brett. Thanks.
All right. So I see questions out there from Mark. We'll get to that. If you have more questions, let's do it. Fatima, if you would join us to round us out.
Hey, Brett. Sorry, that took a minute longer than I expected.
Technology,
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. It's great to follow Tristan and Margaret. Couldn't agree more with a lot of the KPIs and key messaging that they discussed, and excited to dive in.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking with you about avoiding missteps in creating relationships with your listeners. Before we do that, you were such an awesome collaboration partner and sponsor of the report. Want to make sure you get the opportunity, just in case people aren't aware of who Quill is, who CoHost is, maybe share some perspective there, and we'll dive in.
Absolutely. I love this 30-second sales pitch that I
That's
love
right.
to graciously do. So Quill is a full-service production agency. We work with Fortune 500 brands to launch their branded podcasts and also market their shows. So not only is it our job to create a high-quality show, but it's also our job to drive in our clients' audiences. Until a few years ago, the only data that you could really find on your podcast was how many downloads, how many listeners, like the basic stats. well, when you're working with Fortune 500 brands, you can't really get away with the basic stats to prove ROI. And so we launched CoHost, which is the world's first analytics tool for brands who are podcasting. And our focus is all about showing you who your listeners are, things like age, gender, household income, where your listeners are coming in from, what companies are listening, in case you want to turn it into a sales lead generation funnel for your business. And so we're all about being the Google Analytics of podcasting.
I love it. So you've built these businesses, and we talked about the growth of these businesses when we were kind of off air. But you built these businesses in the podcast space, and you've created products and services. I'm curious, like, how do you, as the CEO of these businesses, how do you not only think about the customers that you support, but the listeners on the other side as well?
Well, for starters, we won't do the vanity projects. So we get a lot of those requests, and that's definitely not a fit for our portfolio. I think that a lot of the work goes into the creative positioning that we do. I know our production team is tuning into this webinar, and really I have to give them all of the credit. When we're starting with a client, we do this exercise, and we call it the positioning exercise, where we take a look at A, ideal listener profile, who are we creating this show for, and B, what is your competitive matrix? So what other shows are already out there, and how are you going to be the first, the best, or different? If you don't fall into one of those three categories, then we definitely aren't going to be, creating content that already exists out there. And I think that's really the key focus. It doesn't matter how in the weeds we get with marketing and data and analytics. The first priority should always be creating a show that is marketable, creating a show that people will want to consume, and wearing the lens. Are folks going to be retained all the way to the end? Is your average consumption rate going to be greater than 85%? If the answer is no, then it probably doesn't deserve an audio format concept.
So I think we get this push, or we have this desire, we got to start this show, and we just have this idea and we just get out and do it. But what I hear from you is that, I think if we take a step back before we just go and do some research, try to understand premise, things that we're trying to accomplish, the opportunity of that podcast being successful goes up. How do you explain that maybe to your clients who might be on a timeline? They're saying, I'm ready to do this tomorrow. I need your help with X, Y, and Z. But you have seen this structure that works. How do you advise your clients to maybe take a step back and maximize the planning phase before you just go?
But in other words, do it properly without taking any shortcuts.
That's right.
It's really interesting because I find, and I've been doing this for a really long time, and you start to notice these patterns and trends. It's always the clients that are exclusively utilizing their podcast as a sales lead generation tool that are in a race to the finish line. But and I think absolutely podcasting can be used as a sales funnel. In fact, we encourage it. But I do think that when you're creating a podcast, it's for brand awareness and thought leadership. It's to tell a story. If you're completely and exclusively focused on sales, then podcast is not necessarily the right avenue for you, because going on a show and pitching your products and services isn't something that's going to resonate with listeners. And so in the planning stage, that's what we're doing. It's how do we organically work in the business's products and services and KPIs and initiatives without making it a sales show, without making it dry content or two people having a conversation about what's happening at XYZ brand, and more so creating a story arc, telling a story, and actually providing some sort of entertainment to folks on the other end of the audio. And so I think most brands, I would say, really understand that. I have to say I'm pleasantly surprised in the last couple of years, the caliber of brands that have come forward for a show who proactively will say they don't want to create a sales commercial. And if they do want to create a sales commercial, then I say there are other growth marketing tactics out there like social ads that you should be focusing on, that the data-driven growth tactics are probably going to be much more impactful for your business sales than maybe a podcast will.
So one thing we picked up from just the data in the report was just that podcast listeners are likely to find podcasts in places they're already going for content. maybe talk a little bit about just the process of distribution and like how important you believe that the distribution process is in order to get in front of the right people as you're a host trying to promote your show.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we identify when brands come to us who already have a podcast is how their show is living in isolation on the listening apps like Apple, Spotify, Google. If you're a brand and you're podcasting, you really have to think about it as a part of your core marketing ecosystem and really leverage your own channels. To me, it's a very big missed opportunity when you have really great evergreen content on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, but you're not taking your transcripts and converting it into SEO formatted recap blogs for accessibility. You're not, perhaps taking a full-length audiogram or even the video and putting it on YouTube as a video series, or converting some of that for bite-sized social content. I think gone are the days where you create something and just have it live in a box in the corner, and rather we're trying to do is maximize distribution, because we know different people live in different platforms. For me, I'm exclusively a podcast listener. I don't really watch TV, or I'm not a huge Netflix consumer. I'm not ever on YouTube. I can't remember the last time I used YouTube, but I am on Spotify listening to podcasts. So I am the candidate to have your show on the listening apps. But I know tons of people. My 20-year-old nephew, he exclusively watches all of his content on YouTube or TikTok. So if you're looking to reach a wider audience, or you're looking to maximize your distribution, you can't just be thinking of it as an isolated podcast.
That's so good. I think about that a lot, and just the fact that we once lived in a world where you could just publish a blog post and then people just came to your website like a magnet and request a demo. That doesn't really happen anymore because that's been oversaturated. So I love that about distribution and going on offense. You mentioned maybe some of the things that people aren't doing on the distribution front that might be missed opportunities, but I'm curious, just other common missteps just that you advise clients on, just in terms of like things that they're doing or not doing right that might create some sort of distance between the shows that they're creating and the people they're trying to reach.
I think two of my biggest sort of pet peeves in this industry, the first Tristan already sort of addressed, which is our industry is very bogged down by the number of downloads and listeners, and don't really pay attention to the other metrics that are arguably way more important. I think downloads are a data point. You should absolutely be measuring your reach, but I can't tell you the amount of folks who don't really understand the average consumption or retention metrics, where your drop-off's happening. Somebody drops off in the first 5 minutes of your podcast, that constitutes as a listener or a download, but it doesn't speak to the success of your content. So those engagement metrics like loyal listeners, retained listeners, listeners over a short period of time, average consumption rate, episode consumption rate, where are the listeners coming in from? And then the whole reason we built CoHost to show you demographic data. So that matters to me more, because are you creating this show for an intended audience? Then don't you want to make sure that you're hitting that intended audience? How are you supposed to do that if you're only focused on downloads as a metric? So I would say that to me is like a very big education component when we are talking to brands and clients, making sure that they understand that success is a very well-rounded picture, and the way that we prove ROI is looking at the cost per minute of human attention, rather than just constantly looking at, well, how many people clocked into your show over a 60-second play. The second, I would say, gap within our industry, or more so of an education piece, is investing the same amount of time that you do in producing your show into marketing your podcast. I think that is a really big missed opportunity, because the existence of your show is not enough when there's 5 million podcasts out there. Yes, granted, 18% of them are active, but at the end of the day, there is content fatigue out there. And so if you want to get your show noticed, you have to invest time in the organic and paid marketing tactics, rather than just hoping your listeners will come because you've created a show.
These are just fireworks are going off in my brain right now, because these are like some of my favorite points that you're just hitting home. Maybe we close out with this. I would love to maybe get some examples or just observations you've made from anyone you've worked with, or maybe you haven't worked with them, you're just seeing from afar, but just any examples of stories that you'd point to about shows, show hosts companies who are kind of doing things right and are really killing it on the podcast side because they're doing all of the right things right now?
One of my favorite branded podcasts is called Hackable. It's by McAfee. It was produced by a really great team called Pacific Content. And they are one of the perfect examples of not creating a sales commercial, but creating a sales commercial. It's just, you wouldn't know it because they've weaved it in so subtly into a story that they've told. And, every single episode was listened to. We were at the edge of our seats. And so one of my favorite shows that I recommend everyone listen to, two more recent shows that I have been really enjoying. One of them is produced by Muneris. They produce it in-house. It's called Yes, We Are Open. And again, another great show, I think, where they really repurpose their content. Expedia's Powering Travel is another one. Full caveat, we produce that show. But, their team has been really great about leveraging their internal channels to maximize distribution rather than just expecting us to put it on the listing apps, do some light marketing. They really are everywhere with their podcast.
That's amazing. Fatima, this was awesome. Appreciate you sharing your knowledge. I'll keep you up on the stage and we'll get to some questions. We got some questions coming in. I'll ask Margaret and Tristan to join us. We'll have a big old party here all on the stage at one time. Brady Bunch style. What's going on, everybody? All right, we got some questions in. So I am going to point guard these questions. And if you have questions, we've got let's see, we got about 9 minutes, so we'll see how many we can get to. Feel free to drop them in. The first one comes from Mark. Mark's question is, what are your thoughts on co-hosting a podcast with another company? I'm co-hosting with another founder at a company, or should I really just be doing it for my company solo? I'll throw it to Tristan first.
Let's see. I think this can work. Let me go back to the two things we talked about, Brad, that are most important. Who is this show for and how does it help? If this dynamic if you're hosting with someone from another company and like your audiences intersect and it makes a lot of sense and you have good rapport, then I think it could work really well. I think it really just boils down to, does that relationship exist? Does it benefit the audience? Yeah, I mean, it could be a good solution. So I don't think because you're at different companies that you should exclude that possibility. That's my gut reaction there.
Margaret, what do you say?
Well, I love a podcast with a repeatable dynamic. Yeah, I'd agree with what Tristan said. I think if the audience overlaps and you can consistently create content that serves both companies' audiences and that neither of those companies' values or kind of stray from each other, I think that it's doable. I also think that these are non-permanent decisions, right? Do it until it doesn't work and then make something new in the future.
Totally. And Fatima, you?
I mean, I agree with both Tristan and Margaret. At the end of the day, I think it depends on what business objective is your podcast serving. And if it aligns with this co-partner or co-host, then why not if you're reaching the same target audience? Otherwise, I think that if it's not on brand and you're not trying to reach the same audiences, it's probably a missed opportunity because it's better to be something to someone rather than everything to everyone. And so you just really need to align on that.
I love it. So a question came in the chat from Alan that is a phenomenal question, and is a question I talk with a lot of marketers about. And Tristan kind of teased it a little bit when we were talking about the relationship between my CEO, Jonathan, and us getting Modern Day Marketer off the ground. Fatima, maybe we'll start with you on this one. Do it snake style. What are some tips on persuading your CMO on the flywheel benefits of a podcast? He says this may have been addressed, but he had to step out. It has not been addressed, but I think this is an awesome topic. So Fatima, take us away.
Great question, Alan. So I'm going to assume that my CMO is the one that I'm convincing. And I think every CMO has different goals for their marketing team, whether it's data-driven marketing or, sales and lead generation. I think one surefire way of convincing your CMO is to move into the sales lead pipeline. And that's why we built CoHost. I'm going to use this opportunity to do a shameless pitch. We can show you what companies are listening to your podcast, and then break it down by industry, location. Soon, hopefully, LinkedIn profiles, we're working on it. And that gives you, it's like what Leadfeeder and Zoom Info are doing for your website traffic, we're trying to do for podcast listeners. And I think if you're able to create a natural sales funnel for your podcast show, that can really prove ROI to data-driven growth marketers. And even if you're not leveraging the data, inviting prospective folks that you're trying to build a relationship with to be a subject matter expert on your podcast is a really great way to build a relationship with them. And then, of course, there's the primary benefit, which is brand awareness, creating a really intimate connection with your listeners, reaching a global audience, and being able to tell your brand story and humanizing that process a little bit. We all know these great brands like Expedia and PwC and Amazon, but we don't really know the human stories or what's happening behind closed doors. And so I think it's an opportunity to tell your story your way.
I love it. Margaret, what do you say?
Your CMO probably has to go talk to your CFO about it. So make sure that they really understand and are speaking the same language about what this is doing. And I think the worst thing that I see right now happening between CMOs and CFOs, or heads of marketing and CFOs, is that they're trying to look at marketing by channel and the ROI of that channel rather than by marketing program. And I think if you can arm your CMO to talk about this as a program and not a channel, they will be more armed to have a more thoughtful and insightful conversation about the ROI of the money that you're going to spend on podcast. So it's exactly what you're talking about. It's the flywheel effect of, listen, these are all of, like, by creating this content, we then can create all of this saturation on all of these channels. We can use it, to your point of before, we were talking about using it as a carrot in a sales funnel. We can use it as content to nurture people, nurture customers, whatever it is. Pull it out, and it's not podcast is a channel that we're investing in, but it's truly a program that can support lots of different business activities.
Take a note on that one. There's the CFO angle is more and more becoming a piece of everything we do. So awesome thoughts. Tristan?
Yeah, I think maybe it's two questions. You answer this question with two questions. So first, do you feel like content is a good strategy at all? If you don't, then that's an uphill battle, probably. But if you do feel like content is the route to take, and that's how you win across all these channels, then what is a better way to get this flywheel going than a podcast? I mean, I would, and I'd say it all the time that, like, every tech company does need a podcast, whether it's 0 downloads or not. I just don't know a more effective way to get this flywheel going. And it could be just a way to spark ideas or what have you for maybe, a deeper dive into other content, programs that you're creating. But, like, at least this gets everything going. And I think that's the most important thing. It's like you need to get the flywheel spinning somehow and break out of these silos where you're just creating one piece of content for one channel. It's like, how can all of this work together?
I love it. We're going to do a quick rapid fire, and we're going to close this out. We're going to start with Fatima because the question is addressed specifically to you, but I want to hit everyone real quick, rapid fire. Sarah says, what are some marketing tactics that you find very effective? I would imagine this is in the context of promoting a podcast episode. So, like, if everyone maybe goes around and say, like, what is one must do thing that we should be thinking about to try to get our podcast seen by the right people, and then we'll send this thing home. But Fatima, we'll start with you.
If I'm going to speak to one that I find incredibly effective, it's going to the source of where podcasters are consuming their content, which is the listening apps. So running ads on listening apps like Spotify, where folks are tuning in to consume audio format shows, and maybe not spending your limited budget, if it's limited budget, on social ads like Google, Instagram. Like, those ads are really great for brand awareness, but they don't actually move the needle in terms of podcast listeners.
Margaret?
It sounds so silly, but make sure you're thinking about your CTAs. What are you telling somebody to do? Ask for what you want. If you want subscribers, ask for subscribers. If you want, whatever it might be, reviews, ask for reviews. I, have been in marketing for a long time, and it still absolutely floors me that a well-timed, well-placed CTA can make somebody do the thing that you want them to do.
Love it. We've got 25 seconds. Tristan, hit us with something.
Share it organically. Don't worry about putting paid behind it if you're not proud to share what you're learning and experiencing on the show. So that's all I got.
This has been so much fun. Hey, everyone, the podcast report, I got a QR code here. Hit it up if you want to learn more. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you to our speakers. You all have a great rest of the day.
Solid CTA, right. Brett.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye, all.